Welcome to From Here to Eternity, a Gateway Seminary podcast about the nations. My name is Phil. I'm the host. I'm a professor of missions here at Gateway Seminary. Until very recently, I lived overseas for around 20 years. In this podcast, we address topics that are related to the cross-cultural spread of the gospel from here in California, across the U.S., and throughout the world. Today, we have Julius Tennal II. He is the International Missions Pastor of the Summit Church in the Raleigh-Durham area. The Summit Church is one of the largest and most influential churches when it comes to missions and evangelism. It is, in many ways, the church that I believe sets the example for a lot of the other churches in the Southern Baptist Convention. And Julius is very much a part of that. He's been a part of the church for about 15 years or so now. So he's seen a lot of growth, and he's been a part of that and part of the progress. So I'm super excited, Julius, that you're here, and thank you for taking the opportunity.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Really, really excited to get to be here.
Hey, can we just start off by telling me a little bit about who you are and how you came to faith in Christ? Can we just share your testimony?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in small town, South Carolina, to believing parents. My mom and dad, both believers. My parents divorced, though, when I was 5. My father left. And for me, when my father left, it kind of left this real fear in me of, I bet at some point, if I don't keep all of God's laws, if I don't, please him, then he'll probably leave me too. And I grew up in a pretty rough area in some ways. And so I was also just angry. I was angry that I was in that situation, angry that my dad wasn't there. I dealt with a lot of anger, got in a lot of fights in school and so on and so forth. So both of those things were happening at the same time. I'm afraid that if I'm not good enough, God will leave me. But also I feel like they're just things that I have to do to survive in the context that I'm in. And my mom was such a faithful example in my life. I can remember her praying over me, and, she's the one that certainly introduced me to Jesus. I grew up in the Black church, so I was there, felt like every day of the week for something. And so a lot of positive influences, but really a lot of deep wrestling as well with the things that I was seeing around me, and the things that are going on inside of me. And so I can remember my pastor of our church. He was like a father figure to me. I can remember going to him 9 years old and asking him, can Jesus do anything about this anger that I feel all the time? And so I knew all the stories. I'd been in church enough to know. I know all the answers to the Sunday school questions, but can he do anything about just the way that I feel all the time? And I remember him sitting me down and just walking me through. And not only can he deal with the anger, but really the greatest issue that you have is your sin, that you've sinned against God. And so that fear that you have is because there is a disconnect because we are sin against God. And so he just explained to me my situation before God, but then also what Jesus had done. So while I was yet a sinner, Christ had died for me. And so that he wasn't waiting for me to clean myself up or to be good enough. But that was the very reason why God had sent his only son down to live the life I should have lived, died the death that I deserved to die, and then raised him from the dead, proving that indeed he was a sufficient sacrifice for my sin. And so not everything changed for me immediately. There were lots of things that I still had to work out. One of the most significant of which was that I just didn't have a lot of godly examples of people who were the same age as me around me. And so I really modeled manhood after what I saw, which wasn't necessarily godly manhood, but something that did change for me instantaneously upon putting my faith in Jesus was that I was no longer afraid of God abandoning me. It was like just instantly I had this assurance that God was pleased with me because of Christ, and that I didn't have to do anything, that it was while I was a sinner that he did that. And now much more that I belong to him, that he was never going to leave me or forsake me. And so that was my coming to faith. I still wrestled with a lot of stuff around me. And really my experience of discipleship was reading the Bible and just trying to figure out, where do I draw my lines in the sand? And there was, I see things around me that I know I shouldn't do. And so just trying to take what I saw in the scriptures and try to apply it the best I could, but mostly disconnected from a community of people who are my age trying to do the same thing. And so fast forward to going to UNC to college, and then I'm in a college ministry. I'm surrounded by people who are following after Jesus, and I'm seeing godly examples of guys dating girls, and that I had never really seen. And so that really, for me, I came to faith early, but college was really a greenhouse time for me of growing in my faith and seeing godly examples. And a lot of the path that I would be put on and where I am today has to do with stuff that happened when I was in college.
When you got to college to when you got to the summit, was there a bit of transition between then, or did that happen at the same time?
Yeah, good question. I started out, I got connected to another church when I first got to college. There was a college pastor there who was leading a Bible study, and so I came in. In fact, the Baptist campus ministry that I was a part of, they actually helped me move in, which is how I got connected to them. And so there was a guy that was connected to that who was attending FBC, First Baptist Church of Durham. And so that's where I started. I did a Bible study with those guys, got connected to their college ministry, and it was great. It was really helpful. Then I stopped going to church altogether for a while. It was kind of like I had this realization for the first time, nobody's making me do this. And so I don't have to do this. And so I tried sleeping in a few Sundays and not going to church, and conviction came very quickly to me. What are you doing? You belong to me. I want you to come meet with me. And so God ended that very quickly in my life. And I remember that there were things. FBC was a really great church, and really is a great church. We still have a great partnership with them now. But for me, coming from a small Black Baptist church to FBC, medium-sized, predominantly white, full orchestra, it was like just culture shock is what I was experiencing. And so that was really tough. I remember a guy saying he went to the Summit Church, didn't really know anything about the Summit, but I just asked him, hey, will you come pick me up on Sunday mornings and take me with you? And I got to Summit. I pull up to where we were meeting at the time, this warehouse, and I thought, I've made a huge mistake. This is, I don't know what this is, but I'm this warehouse, and I can hear the music from outside, and this is crazy. And so I went in pretty skeptical, honestly, of the Summit Church and what this experience was going to be like. But man, when I got in and Pastor JD was preaching, the gospel that he was preaching, it just grabbed a hold of me. And I kept coming back, largely because of his preaching. And I just was captivated by the message that he was preaching. Jesus, the gospel was so clear. His mission was so clear. And then increasingly, I got connected to other college students, and that kept me being a part of the Summit. So it was about a semester that I was at FBC Durham, and then I got connected to the Summit after that.
Okay. So you're at the Summit. You've stayed pretty much ever since, and now you're in a position of you've become. It's not the easiest to become one of the pastors at the Summit Church. So you've probably put in a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so how did that all come about? How did the leaders at the time see the leadership abilities in you that perhaps maybe you didn't even see in yourself?
Yeah. Well, first, before anything, I remember seeing. I didn't know, again, I knew nothing about the Summit Church. I didn't know we were multi-site. I didn't know any of those things. And so that my first times at the Summit Church, at that time, we were overwhelmingly white. And I didn't really see anybody who looked like me. And so never did it cross my mind that I would, I could be a pastor here. That wasn't anything that I was thinking at the time. But I saw this video. And in the video, it was an African-American pastor, and it said campus pastor. And I'm looking around me, and I'm like, I don't see anybody who looks like this guy or looks like me. And so where's this guy? Campus pastor. He's a campus pastor of the Summit Church. Where is this? And so then I start to figure out, okay, we've got other campuses. But that was the first time that I thought, oh, maybe I could be a leader here, or be just like seeing an example of somebody who looked like me was significant. I don't think if that hadn't happened, I'm not sure that I would have even made some of the decisions that I made. And I'm not even sure that I would have stuck around had that not happened. So he would end up becoming a mentor of mine, which I'll get to in a minute. But so how did the summit invest in me? One, college ministry. I was a part of a college ministry, the leader of which was a member at the summit. They're actually still really significant in my life. So my college pastor, his name was Lee Sullins. He's over spiritual life at CBU right now. And so him and Laura, they just invited me in. I got to see them parent their kids. They became like parents to me. I remember we very early on went through Reason for God by Tim Keller, which just was so helpful for me being at UNC in a skeptical environment. That helped me grow a ton. So being a part of their family, seeing Lee and the way he led and being able to read books off his shelf and learn from him was really significant. I became a leader in our college ministry largely because of his investment in me. So that was a big part of it. I started serving in student ministry, wanting to serve with the church, and that was one of the open doors to me. And so I was leading a middle school Bible study. I did that for a while, and as I was doing that, we were talking about opening up a campus in Chapel Hill, actually. And so that guy that I had seen on that video years before, he was going to be the campus pastor of Chapel Hill. And so he actually called me and said, "Hey, I know you've been serving in student ministry. Would you consider coming and starting the student ministry at Chapel Hill when we open this campus?" And I was like, absolutely not. I mean, I've never done anything like that. To start something, I wouldn't even know where to start with something like that. So I tried to get out of it. He asked me if I would just come in and sit down with him and another guy and just talk about it. And so I agreed to do that. And they convinced me somehow to just trust God. And I think, you were mentioning seeing things. I don't know what they saw, but I think they saw something. And but they just said, "Hey, why don't you just trust us and trust God, and will you consider and pray about doing this?" And so I did. I started the student ministry at the Chapel Hill campus. Had a few families that had kind of moved over from the campus where we had been, and started with those students. And man, I'll tell you that probably one of the most significant things in my life and ministry up to this point was doing that, learning to partner with parents, to disciple their kids. And, one story in particular stands out of one of my students. Her mom got diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer.
Ooh. Mm.
And yeah, I'm a 22-year-old at the time, and she wanted some pastors and leaders from the church to come do communion with her and her family, and just to comfort her after this diagnosis. And so me and my supervisor, we go over to do communion with them. And from there, she decided that she wanted to do this prayer meeting on a monthly basis, and that she wanted to invite unbelievers in, because she wanted them to see her live out her faith, even as she was likely coming to the end of her life. Yeah. And my boss looks at me and says, "I want you to preside over this prayer meeting." And I'm 22. I'm thinking like, man, I don't know how in the world I can do something like that. And he's like, "But I want you to do this." And I remember just every time I was driving over there, every night I was driving over there, I remember thinking, "God, if you don't show up, like if you don't move, then I have no idea what I'm going to do when I get here. I have no wisdom of my own to speak of. I've got no experience to lean on. I don't have seminary at this point to look to. All I have is you." And that was the most formative season in my life, learning to depend on the Spirit, that God would be faithful, that he would show up, that he could use me, that he wanted to, and that it wasn't primarily because I was this great gifted guy or these great abilities that I had, but just that he wanted for me to see how great he was. And so walking with her, she would eventually die, but that student that I got to invest in today is serving as a missionary. And so I've been a part of the church long enough to see her grow and to be a part of her assessment process and to see God call her overseas to serve. And so the church has, from JD preaching the heart of God, which for me, being from small town South Carolina, I thought the rest of the world was getting out of South Carolina for me. It was like, that's how big the world is for me. But from JD preaching just clearly from the scriptures that God's heart is for all nations, to him preaching that God's mission advances through the planning of churches, to then getting involved in student ministry, being poured into by my campus pastor, him believing in me, challenging me to trust God, to believe him, to keep taking the next step towards where God was leading. After that, I would end up jumping into college ministry. And so we have an HBCU, historically Black university, called North Carolina Central University. And so I would start leading ministry there. And every summer we would challenge students to do our summer project, which would be kind of a month in Durham doing kind of internships and learning. We would go do a week in New York City with Global Gates, just throwing them into the deep end of praying and sharing the gospel with unreached peoples, and then 2 weeks overseas at the end of the summer. And so that was actually one of those summers was my first international mission trip. And so I led a trip to Eastern Europe, the next year to South Africa. And it was doing that, leading these trips, challenging these students to consider how they could give their lives to the mission of God after they graduate. And after 3 years of doing that, it was like the Holy Spirit said to me and my wife, are you as open as you're asking these students to be? Are you willing to go? And are you willing to join me in another place? And so my wife, her name is Brittany, we began praying about that. And, just as he continued to open the next door to us going, we ended up applying through the IMB and going and serving overseas for 3 years. And so it was being a part of ministry, being poured into by pastors of the church, them challenging me to follow God, and then ultimately taking what we had been doing with students, asking if we were asking the same question of God that ultimately led us overseas and on a church planting team in Johannesburg, South Africa. We did that for 3 years, and then the Lord called us back to be a part of mobilizing others. And so came back to this missions team at our church, starting with doing training and assessment. And then about 3 years ago, I stepped into the role of leading as the international missions pastor.
Yeah, I see a pretty keen sense of authenticity in what you're doing. You don't want to you want to practice what you preach, right? So you kind of gotta talk about people being missionaries. It's maybe not a bad idea for you to do it yourself, right? Yeah,
that's right.
Hey, let me ask you a question. Throughout this conversation so far, you've mentioned like some important people in your life. A lot of these people being pastors, and as a pastor yourself, how intentional are you with people who are interested in doing overseas work, and how, just in general, do you see the role of a pastor playing in people's lives? How, because certain people, they get it from a professor, they get it from this person, they get it, but as a pastor, and the influences the pastors have had in your life, how does that translate to your leadership style today?
Yeah, that's great, man. I think one of the most significant things that pastors have done for me, and I to your point, I don't think that it is something that only a pastor can do, but it has been pastors in my life. I call it crown holding. I think they saw something that God could be doing and wanted to do in my life, and they just held up this belief of what I could be if I was willing to submit to him over my head until I grew up into it. So I think for pastors, I do think there is a uniqueness to the authority they have in a church context, where when you say something, when you speak something, when you say, hey, I see in you God doing this, it means something. It is weighty, and you have to be very careful about that, the way you wield that. But these men have seen something in me, and they've held it up over me and said, we see God doing something. And if you're willing to trust him enough to follow him, then we believe that he can probably do more in and through you than you could imagine. And so not only did they believe that for me, then they said, hey, and we will help you. And so they poured into me, helped teach me different skills, whether it was communication or conflict resolution, or they just kind of took me under their wing and said, hey, come with me, watch me do this, and then feedback with me and process with me. And so, yeah, I try to be very intentional doing the same thing to others. I want to be a challenge to myself is I want to be one of the first to see something in somebody. And so I'm just trying to be very prayerful and intentional in conversation with God. And I want to say, what are you doing in this person, particularly people that I lead on my team, or people that are in a small group that I lead, or people that are at my campus? Just what is God doing? And I want to say it, bring attention. Hey, I see God doing this in you. And I think that can only come with time. I got to spend time with people. And so people in my small group, that's very natural. I try to take people on trips because that gives me great time with people to be able to see what God might be doing in them, and then say it, and then ask the question, how can I help you grow up into that? And so what is it that you need? What's the gap between where God is wanting to take you and where you are? And how can I walk with you in those next steps to get to where God is wanting to take you? So I'm trying to do what people have done with me, for sure.
Huh. While you were talking, I was thinking about something that you mentioned a little bit earlier. You overseas for 3 years in a very, not as Johannesburg. It's not the most Western place in the world, I guess. Is that if I can say, is that correct to say that? It's not like, it's not the U.S. or anywhere like that, and they've had a history of some pretty evil things that have gone on in South Africa.
Yep.
But you've come back, and what was the experience about coming back, reacculturating into America, the reverse culture shock?
Yeah, I was actually just processing this with somebody. I don't know that Brittany and I had a real appreciation for how hard our transition back to the U.S. was. Particularly because we did it in COVID. So we came back in October of 2020, also with a new human being. So we left as just a couple. We came back with, at that time, a 6-month-old in COVID. So in COVID and right before an election. So it was a very tense time politically for our country. And then we weren't meeting together. We were trying to be very careful with our new son, and who had also already had COVID at that point. He had COVID when he was 3 months old. So we had an experience with that already. And so between what is naturally hard about transitioning back, we've invested 3 years here. We have these significant relationships. And yes, we've come back to a church that we know, but it's a very changing church always, right? We're sending out people. People are coming, they're going. So a lot of our closest friendships are not necessarily still here. And as we come back, we're not meeting together as a church because of the pandemic. And so a lot of the things that would make a already hard transition a little bit easier were not available to us because of the pandemic. And so that was a challenge. And then my wife was dealing with postpartum depression. That we'd come to find out that was what was going on. Not too long after that, she would get pregnant with another child, and then we would lose that child. And so so we dealt with a lot of naturally hard things about transitioning back to the U.S. And then just some things that were difficult about that timing of it being right before an election, intense time, and then the pandemic, but then also just suffering that we experienced that made it a challenge. We are very grateful for, one of the things that happened is we started a small group at that time by necessity. So we just said a lot of people are not meeting together. We are not going to make it if we don't start to build some close connections back here. And so out of necessity, we said, we'll start a small group. And so we started with a couple people. We went and asked a couple of people that we had some relationship with already, one who had just moved back to the U.S. herself. And we started a small group with her and a guy that I had been investing in since he was in college. And that was a grace from God for us in that season. I also had One of the pastors at our campus that we ended up coming back to was one of my closest friends, and his wife was a good friend to my wife as well. And so those relationships were incredibly important to us as well. But we struggled. That was a struggle to come back and to transition at that time. And I think we are just now really coming around to how difficult that time was for us.
I was talking to I think Scott Hildreth, who's quite well, and we had a similar conversation with him about reverse culture shock, and he was overseas for about a decade or so, and said, Phil, it took me about 8 years to really just get over culture shock. So people say, I've heard the saying, for every year you're overseas, it takes a month or so to get over it. And it's probably closer to 6 to 8 months, just hearing from him, from another guy you may recognize, a guy named Scott Logston. He was pastor of Dutch Chapel now. He mentioned the same thing. And it's good to hear that it's not that reverse culture shock is actually a real thing. Yep. And you need to give yourself time. And I think that's sometimes the hardest thing to do. Hey, you've talked a lot about family. And, family, you're growing up and your parents, divorcing and your family being part of your ministry. Yeah. Some of the tragedies that you've had losing a child. And can you talk about family and ministry and how that looks like in the summit and how that looks overseas and just the importance of it in your own life in ministry?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've developed as a very strong conviction, and I want to be very careful in the way that I say this, but, in reading missionary biographies, I think obviously there's so much that we have to learn. There are levels of sacrifice that people made there that we just can't even comprehend. Like just getting on a boat and not knowing whether you ever come back again. It wasn't as easy as getting on a plane, and right. There are real sacrifices that people made that we have a lot to learn from, and that it is right for us to honor. Having said that, one of the things that I have a strong conviction is that I do think that many missionaries in the past sacrificed their families in ways that I do not believe God has called us to. And so I just have a strong conviction that in God calling me to the ministry that he's called me to, that faithfulness in my private ministry of my family is as important as faithfulness in my public ministry. Or said another way, I actually think there is no path to faithfulness in my public ministry without faithfulness in my private ministry to my family. And so I have a responsibility to make sure that I am investing as much, if not more, in my family as I am investing in my public ministry. And then even more significantly, though, my family, they're my ministry partners. And so my sons, I've got 3 sons. They're all very young, 5, 3, and 2. And so on the one hand, right, we want them themselves to understand the gospel, to believe, to grow in faith. But also right now, I treat them as my disciples. They are disciples of mine. And so I try to, especially from my oldest son, right, who's 5, he comes with me sometimes when I go preach at other churches. And he's a part of things that, like, right now I know he doesn't understand and that he has a short attention span for. But I want him there with me so he knows that you're a part of this. It's not just me. It's not just something that me and Brittany do, but this is something we do as a family. It's a calling that we have because of what we believe about Jesus and his worthiness. And so, yeah, I think, one, I don't want to sacrifice my family on the altar of ministry. I think that is unfaithful to the vision that God has for family in the world. I don't think it's necessary for me to be a faithful minister of the gospel. And in fact, I think it is counter to me being faithful to ministries of the gospel. I think the Summit Church has a very high view of family. And so I think they also try to be very intentional to give us adequate time away to be with our families, of recognizing in seasons where they're asking more of us to then supplement that with intentional times where they're allowing us to get away with our families. I think they try to be very inclusive of wanting our families to be a part of our ministries and wanting us to be healthy as disciples. As the Summit Church is very invested in me being a healthy father, a healthy husband, in addition to being a healthy pastor. And so I'm thankful for that. So
that's just really, it's funny you mentioned that, because I remember my dad was a church planter in New England, years ago in the 70s. And he used to take me to these denominational meetings. I was the only kid there, but I get to hang out with my dad. I didn't know what was going on, but it really did, I think that played a role in actually me going into ministry. And I think it's, I really appreciate your position and your thoughts on missionaries not doing family well. I think I see that overseas. For 20 years I was overseas, I saw that a lot. And it's scary in many ways, because so I very much appreciate that example that you're putting into, because you just, the scripture's pretty, especially when it comes to pastors, right? It's pretty clear about, you have to be a good father, and that you can't neglect that. So I very much appreciate that. I want to transition just a little bit to asking a question. You've been in ministry, what, 15 years now, 15, 20 years going on roughly?
Yeah, it's been like 13 years now.
Okay. So you're midway through, maybe still a little bit early in your ministry, but the Lord has blessed you. What's one thing you wish you would have known earlier in your ministry that you know now?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have struggled with, just maybe by personality, I remember, so everything that I've done pretty much up till now, previous to this role, was starting something. So it was a very pioneer oriented thing. And I remember pretty early on recognizing that and saying, I wonder why that is, because I'm not a pioneer. I don't feel like a pioneer. I don't feel like I am gifted in this way. And I even remember sitting down with Pastor JD and asking him, why do you think God keeps calling me to these pioneer oriented things when I don't think that I'm a pioneer? And I remember him saying to me, it's probably not true that you're not a pioneer, but it will be interesting for you to process why you feel that way. And at the time I was pretty frustrated by that. I thought, what does that even mean? What do you mean? But as I have processed that over the years, what I recognize is I assumed some things about what it meant to be a pioneer. I assumed that you had to be this big personality. I assumed that you had to be extroverted. I assumed that, in other words, you had to be something that was very different than what I felt I was in order to have this gift that it seemed like God was clearly giving to me. And then I recognized, this is because I assume that spiritual gift means that something is easy. If I'm gifted in this, it should be easy for me. It should not be hard, and really what I'm saying is it shouldn't produce dependence on God. It should be something I'm able to do on my own, right? And so just coming around to, no, that's not what a spiritual gift is. It is something that is intended to produce more intimacy with God as you get to partner with him, to see him be pleased to use you in these ways. But it doesn't mean easy. It doesn't mean that it produces self-reliance or independence. It's still supposed to promote dependence in you, even as I get to see God move powerfully through this way that he's wired me. So I wish that I would have spent less time evaluating what God may have been calling me to based on what I felt like I could do naturally or what was comfortable for me. And I wish what I know now is, hey, if Jesus is leading me in that direction, we're going. I don't care whether it makes sense to me. I'm not going to start by analysis of whether I have the right tools or not. I trust that God is either giving me what I need or he will give me what I need. But I don't want to miss out on what God is doing because I'm afraid that I might not be able to do it. I won't be able to do it apart from the grace and mercy of God. But because God is with me, I want to be with him wherever he is and whatever he's doing. So before I tried to rationalize too much, does this make sense? Can I do that? Do I have the things that I need? And now I just know it's just a question of, is Jesus calling me? And if he's calling me, then he's going to equip me. But I don't want to miss out on what he's doing because I'm afraid.
With the Lord calling you in these different directions, you mentioned a little while ago about this, how suffering has played a role in that. Would it be possible for you to talk a little bit about that and like your understanding? Not that we need to get all theological, but can you talk about your in essence, your theology of suffering and how that has worked out practically?
Yeah. One of the things that makes me think of immediately is I have this, because of language from scripture, I think like, okay, God draws near to me in suffering. And when we had our first miscarriage, which happened when we were in South Africa before the birth of our first son, Azariah. So before that, we had a miscarriage. And I remember thinking, if it's true that God draws near to me in my suffering, then it would seem to imply that he then at some point moves away from us. And I just really wrestle with that. What does it mean that he draws near to us? And I remember God giving me this picture, even as we were driving home from the hospital where we were told that we had lost our baby. I remember God giving me this picture of the night sky and just kind of asking, are the stars closer to me during the night? Is that why we see them? Because they're closer, and during the day they move further away, and that's why we can't see them. And obviously that's not the case. Obviously it's true that the night sky, it makes it obvious. What has already been there, what has been there during the day, becomes obvious to us at the night. And I one of the things that God used that to help me see was, hey, I don't move away from you. You move, you can go, but I don't move. But what suffering does is it makes my compassion, my grace, my comfort, my mercy, it makes it more obvious to you, because you've become more desperate for it. You see it more clearly. But hey, just so we're clear, that is available to you always. Always. I don't move. I don't change. And so I think one of the things that suffering does, there are things that you can't know. A mentor has said this to me, and it's really resonated with me. There are things about God that you cannot know until you are in need or until you are in suffering. You don't know what it means for God to be a very present help in the time of trouble until you're in trouble. You don't know what it means that God is your comforter until you need comfort. You don't know what it means that he will not abandon you until you feel abandoned by others, right? And so there are just things that God wants us to see about himself, ways that he wants us to know him. And he uses brokenness in the world to magnify or to make more obvious the things that he is to us. And so I think there's probably been no greater refiner to my pastoral abilities than suffering. So there's just something about, coming out of seminary, you think you know a lot. You think you have a lot. I can address that. I can answer that question. And again, going back to something I said earlier, right, I'm sitting with this woman who's coming to the end of her life, pancreatic cancer, and she's asking questions like, the Bible has many promises to the righteous. How do you know that you're righteous? And again, this is pre-seminary for me, but I think just in the Holy Spirit, I had enough wisdom to know in this moment, she's not asking me a primarily theological question. She doesn't need a theological treatise on righteousness right now. Well, what's happening is she is looking at death in the face and she's afraid, and she wants to know, am I still secure? Does God still have me? Am I still being held by the gospel that has always held me? Is it still holding me now? And so, man, I just think, right, again, by the grace of God, I had enough wisdom to just assure her of her standing before God right then and there. But suffering has also taught me that there are many times where people don't need my theological answers. There are some times where they do, but there are many times where they don't. When we were suffering, when we lost our child in South Africa, we had small group scheduled that night with our South African brothers and sisters. And Brittany was saying, hey, I want to be by ourselves. So I'm texting them, canceling small group that was supposed to be at our house. Hey, guys, this is what just happened. Please don't come. We just want to be by ourselves. And because they're Africans, they ignored everything that I said. And so we get home, not short after, there's a knock on our door, and they show up. They bring food, and they just sit with us. And they don't try to theologize us. They don't try to answer the question of why this has happened. They sit there, they weep with us, they eat with us, and they're there with us. I can't tell you anything that anybody said, not one thing. But I do remember everybody that was there with us. I remember the Sunday where I'm weeping at church, and I remember every time I open my eyes, there's somebody else with their hands on me praying for me. I remember that they were doing that. I don't remember what anybody said, but I remember their presence. And suffering is like that. Jesus doesn't always keep us from suffering. He doesn't always spare us from but he's always with us. He knows what it's like. He has scars in his hands. We can trust him. And so, I think that there's so much that could be said, right, about a theology of suffering. But I think that primarily Jesus wants us to experience more of his intimacy, his sufficiency to carry us, to sustain us, to comfort us. There are things he wants us to know about himself. And like Corinthians says, he wants to comfort us that we might be a comfort to others. And suffering provides a pathway to wisdom. It doesn't ensure that you will be wise, but it is a tool that God can use to make us more wise comforters to others. If Job's friends, I would imagine, had learned a little bit more from their own suffering, they wouldn't have been as quick, I think, to offer very unhelpful and harmful even things in the time of Job's suffering.
Yeah, 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4, I think, is the passage you're referring to. And that is a pretty powerful passage. You mentioned a lot with that. And I think in coming, and I'm thinking about some of the seminary students that we have at Gateway, and people are coming in. How would you, if you could give one piece of advice to seminary students coming into seminary, or maybe just in seminary itself, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say that the primary goal that God has for your time in seminary is that you would know him more deeply. Like he wants you to fall more in love with him. He wants you to be more in awe of him, not more in awe of you, not more in awe of your abilities and your intellect. He wants you to be more convinced that he is worthy of worship by the whole world. And the only way that you will help other people see that he's worthy of worship is by setting an example of your own worship of him. And so I would just say in all of your studies, in all of your reading, and all of your assignments, which are all good, I've done it and it's been very helpful. But in all of it, don't lose sight of your primary responsibility to know and worship God yourself. You cannot lead people to a place that you are not yourself going. And so there is no path to being a faithful pastor or missionary or business leader or whatever it is that God has for you. Husband, mother, wife, father. There's no path without you yourself being a faithful disciple of Jesus, who then goes and makes disciples. So love Jesus with everything and fight to make sure that you are still adoring Jesus yourself and you're not just working for the next assignment or the next sermon, the next thing.
Is there anything you would like to promote or anything or any way that people, if they're interested, could be involved in your ministry?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I don't really have anything to promote, but I would say if you can follow me on Instagram at JB Humble, JBE Humble. I have a link tree there that's attached to my Instagram, and you can find sermons that I've preached. You can find even spoken word poetry that I've performed. It's just a way that you can kind of follow and hopefully be benefited and blessed by some of the things that God has taught me and some of the gifts that God has given me. I also really do love to travel around and speak at different places. And so there's even a speaker request form there if I could serve you in any way. Anyone who is listening to this, in any way that we can partner together, particularly as it relates to missions or the next generation, I would love to do that.
Okay. Are there any books that, if you could recommend people to read, what were some books you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my favorites right now, and especially in missions, is Western Christians in Global Mission by Paul Borthwick. I'm not sure if that's how you say his name or not, but it is a fantastic. It's basically he's wrestling with the question. Some people have looking at, you even mentioned some of the things in South Africa. So looking at just colonial legacies and some of the things, some people are arriving at the conclusion that the time for Westerners to be involved in global mission is over. And it's really the rest of the world. And now we just need to sit back and just give money. That's really our only role. And this fantastic book is arguing that's not true. because Jesus gave us commission to go make disciples, we don't just get to decide that we no longer want to do that, or we no longer have a role to play in that. But what he is arguing helpfully is that it is true that in many ways there are things that we should learn from the past and ways that we should do things differently. And so we need to still be as involved as we've ever been, and even more. We need more involvement that there currently is, but we need to learn from the past and make some changes. And so I think he does a fantastic job making that argument. This one comes right from my pastor, but gaining by losing. If you're a church that's just trying to develop a sending culture, we're going back through it right now as a staff team. I think it's really helpful. And so I would definitely recommend that one. Reading While Black is a book by Esau McCaulley. It is celebrating kind of a Black interpretive lens of Scripture, but it's also helping develop an important skill that I think is important for any Christian, especially any missionary. And it's the ability to determine how your culture shapes the way you approach the Bible. So my culture doesn't sit over the Bible, but it certainly impacts the way that I view the Bible. And sometimes if we're not aware of that, we just assume that the way I read the Bible is the way to read the Bible. And we assume that other people bring their own cultures, especially if you're a missionary. If you're a Western missionary, you assume that the rest of the world, they bring their own cultures and they've got to weave through that. But me, I'm coming from an objective place, and that's just not true. And so I think he provides a very helpful example that we should, whatever your culture might be, that you need to be doing that same kind of work, because there are things that are worth celebrating from your own culture, but there are also things that are probably dangers to the way that you read, or even things that just interrupt your ability to read Scripture rightly. And if you're not aware of those things as you go and try to make disciples, you can end up making more disciples of you than you're making disciples of Jesus. And that's not what anybody wants. Let's see. Anything by Christopher Wright is my favorite missiologist. So I'm a big fan of, I like Mission of God. I mean, it's a big textbook kind of thing, but that's just building the argument that we don't really need just a biblical basis for missions. The whole Bible is missional. The missional basis of the Bible, as his argument, is fantastic, connecting how the whole of Scripture is giving us an argument for why we should join God in his global mission. So those are some of the things that come to my mind.
Hey, let me ask you, like maybe one or two more questions. Could you tell us like one funny story about JD? He's been around for so long, and I've roomed with the guy, so I have some that I'm not going to share. But as his pastor, you may have a bit more leeway to do that.
Yeah. I'll give you two. I'll give you a bonus. Give you two. The first is the very first time I ever had an interaction with him was I was working at Apple at the time, and then part-time on staff as a student director. And so he comes into the Apple store. This is during the holiday season. We're super busy, and I'm manning the station where we just kind of have things that are for quick sales. So if you already know what you want because it's a gift for somebody else and you don't want to talk to anybody, you just want to buy it, I was manning that station. So I've got a lot of iPads behind me so that no one has to bring it out. I've got all these things. JD walks into the store. He walks up to where I am with his phone out, camera on, and he videos and he says, nobody stands in line for me. And I've never had this experience, like records that and then walks out of the store. Now, all of my colleagues are like, who is this guy? And why did he just come in and like record you? And everybody is super disturbed. Nobody knows that this is my pastor. And in this moment, I'm not feeling particularly compelled to tell them that that's my pastor who just walked in and just did this ridiculous thing. So that was one of my first experiences, at least being on staff at that point. But before that, I guess actually my first interaction with JD is me coming in as a college student. I thought, man, I really want to go up and meet him. And I was with a buddy of mine who had been discipling me in college. And he said, you don't want to do that. And I said, yes, I absolutely do. And so I didn't listen to him. I'm like, yeah, let's go. He's like, all right. So we go up. I introduce myself. Hey, JD, I'm here. Been really blessed by your sermons, blah, blah. And JD's like, hey, thank you. And he's kind of looking at me and I'm looking at him. He's kind of shaking his head, smiling. And I'm like, okay, bye. And then I just walk away. And I'm like, that was really awkward. And my buddy says, I told you didn't want to do this. Right. And so it's just funny how he can kind of be awkward in a I don't know you kind of one-on-one kind of setting, but over the years, I've gotten to know him pretty well. And I'm very grateful. Somebody who has the extraordinary gifts that he has, but who's as approachable as he is, the things that he's helped me work through, and the godly character that he has, the humility, the willingness to learn, like these things, I'm really thankful for him being my lead pastor.
Yeah, he's as genuine as they come, and as well as I do, he's been in positions of authority and influence, and he's still been able to maintain his integrity when other people have not. So that's very much a blessing. And I pray for him, because he's in a situation where we know a lot of people where that hasn't happened. But Julie, hey, thank you. I'm going to stop recording and just want to say thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.